And now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Kevin Sabet, and I would like to express how fortunate we are here in Joplin to be able to have a nationally known author here. If you didn't already hear, we are selling his books in the back afterwards, and he will be doing a book signing, so if you would like to purchase that, you're more than welcome to. Dr. Kevin Sabet, he's worked for 3 different presidential administrations. He's traveled the world speaking on this topic. He's very knowledgeable, and we're excited for him to be able to come here and speak upon some of the myths of marijuana. So, Dr. Kevin Sabet, would you mind coming up here and taking the floor?
Thank you very much, Chelsea, and thanks to the Alliance of Southwest Missouri and all of you here tonight that are spending your evening with us to have this important discussion. I think there are probably a diversity of viewpoints that we have on this issue, and I look forward to a robust discussion. I also want to foremost actually thank our panel that really, from so many different perspectives, that to ground us in this issue and understand that this issue is more than just numbers. It's more than just data and facts, which I'll be presenting a lot of today, but it's actually real lives that we're talking about. And it's, I think, important to hear those stories, since they're really not the stories that you normally hear on the news when the news is covering this issue. So thank you for having the courage to share your perspectives and for your service of all of you in the community. It's wonderful to be back in Missouri. I think you've been able to come to your great state a couple of times in the last few years, and always receive a really warm welcome. So I'm going to dive right in so that we can make sure we have enough time for questions, which I'm also going to be excited to engage in. And I'm going to cover a lot in this presentation. I will say as a caveat that everything is available on our website, which is learnaboutsam.com, and this presentation is there along with all the statistics. Everything that I talk about tonight is footnoted and cited and really explained in a lot more detail in my book, which I think we have for sale afterwards, right here. Just to start us off, and I'm not going to go through, by the way, all the 7 myths. We don't have enough time for them. I'm going to focus on a few of them. But just to start off, I thought it would be important just to ground us in terms of the trends in drug use, where we are with our really 3 most prevalent drugs in society. You know, of Americans admit to regularly using alcohol. Regularly is defined as at least once in the last 30 days. About a quarter of Americans use tobacco, of which 95% are cigarettes. That means tobacco products, about 26 to 27%. And between 7 and 9% of Americans smoke marijuana in the at least once in the last month. Interestingly, the number of daily users of marijuana has risen about 42% in the last 4 or 5 years. And among high school seniors, it's tripled from about 2.5% of 12th graders admitting to being daily marijuana users to now close to 6.5 to 7% in the most recent survey. Anyhow, though, but among our general population, where we're talking that tobacco is about 3 to 4 times more prevalent than marijuana, and alcohol is about 5 to 6 times more prevalent. So the first myth that I talk about, a few myths that I will get into detail tonight, is the one that marijuana is harmless and not addictive. And you know, before I start talking about this on the slide, addiction, you know, we should be very clear that actually users of all drugs, that includes alcohol, that actually includes what we would call the hard drugs, or what I would call the more expensive drugs. Users of all of those substances, most of them are not addicted. Okay, so we should be clear tonight that we are not saying that everyone who ever uses a drug, and we're talking about marijuana in this case, will become addicted to it. In fact, the vast majority of users of those who ever try marijuana actually won't become addicted, which is very interesting. But the issue is, just like alcohol, it's the small number of overall users that will become addicted that cause a great harm to society. So with alcohol, for example, we know that the 80-20 rule also applies. In other words, 20% of overall users consume about 80% of the volume of alcohol, right? So 20% very heavy users, the vast majority about that in a little bit. But for marijuana, actually, it's about the same. About if you start in adolescence, as with all drugs, you're much more likely to become addicted. We know that the adolescent brain is really forming up until between age 25 and 28. It's climbing, it's pruning, it's becoming who it's going to be. It's why you learned a second language when you were 2 or 3. If you know a second language versus maybe when you're 50 or 60, it's why your parents wanted to teach you how to ride a bike before you turned age 5, or learn to swim before you turned age 5, as opposed to waiting till you're 50. Your brain is much more malleable at that time. It's able to pick things up. It's the same thing with all drugs, in fact. So if drugs enter an adolescent brain bloodstream, it has a much more likelihood of affecting that person for the rest of their lives, or at least in some acute way, than it would for an adult who would start to do that. So it's really the same. So we know that when it comes to marijuana, of those 16-year-olds who try marijuana, we know about 1 in 6 of those 16-year-olds will eventually, at some point in their lives, become addicted to it. Now, I hear a lot of people say to me, well, 1 in 6 doesn't sound like that many people. And I have a lot of, especially young people, that come up to me after these presentations and say, I use regularly and I really am not an addict. It hasn't disturbed my life. I'm really one of those 5 out of 6, and I don't know anybody who's 1 out of 6. What's so interesting about numbers, I think, if we just keep them in perspective, for those same people that tell me that, I just ask them, well, according to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, how many people do you think who drive drunk get into a fatal car crash? Which is, of course, driving drunk is such a taboo on it now. Nobody's advocating that there's a safe way to drive drunk, but what's the percentage? What are your likelihood of getting involved in a fatal car crash if you drive drunk? Well, if you use MAD's own statistics, the likelihood is about 1 in between 500 and 700 times. In other words, for every time that there's a fatal car crash, there were 499 people who drank and drive and did not get into one. Now, that doesn't mean that we want to go promote drunk driving, but it does just put in perspective, I think, when we talk about numbers and where we are. So now, of course, I switched to a Mac on my own computer. I'm no longer PC literate. But I think we might have frozen. So let's see. There we go. The mouse doesn't want to work. We'll try that. Oh, there we go. So anyway, 1 in 6 become addicted, and like I said, the adolescent brain. Now, if you start marijuana when you're older, your chances are different. It's about 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 adults that will become addicted. So much, much lower than when you start in adolescence. Let's see. Okay. I also get a lot this issue of what's worse in terms of the drugs, and it's going to be hard for you to see that there, but essentially this idea of alcohol versus marijuana versus tobacco versus heroin, etc. And when you look at marijuana, we basically see that it's about as addictive as alcohol. Alcohol addicts 17% of adolescents who try it, marijuana 15%. Tobacco and heroin and cocaine, not surprisingly, much more addictive. And actually, if you don't look at the adolescent number, it's even higher. It's just interesting to see, I think, those drugs next to each other when we get some perspective on what the potential addiction rate is. And a lot of parents and others come up to me and also say, it's hard for them to believe that there's even marijuana addiction. Is that even real? And that's, of course, because a lot of people don't experience with marijuana, as I said before, is benign. And frankly, their friends' experiences are benign. And a lot of these people use marijuana, started at least, in an era that was very different than now. Probably used it for many different reasons, political and otherwise, that are so different for the reasons kids are using now. But the big issue with that is that today's marijuana is not the marijuana really that our parents might have smoked, that my parents might have smoked in the 1960s, or 70s, or 80s, or 90s, really. I mean, only in the last 15 years alone, the potency, the active ingredient in marijuana has tripled, and the other ingredients that actually take the high away have gone down, because we've learned selective breeding techniques that are much more sophisticated than anybody was doing 10, 15, 20, let alone 40 or 50 years ago. And actually, if you look at the average THC levels in blue, the active ingredient, what gets you high, has risen exponentially. The other ingredients, I'm going to go back to something called CBD in a bit, but CBD, cannabidiol, is one of the other ingredients in marijuana. It does not get you high. In fact, it takes the high away. That has been almost bred out of modern marijuana. And we know that early cannabis use I mean, that started a very, very long time ago, had an appreciable amount of CBD in that, in cannabis. Now, the marijuana you get from the street rarely has any CBD in it. You can really only get CBD marijuana at sort of boutique, high-end, expensive medical marijuana dispensaries in places like California. But I will go back to CBD in a minute and why that's important. ER admissions, while we have the same number, relatively close, the same number of users from the early 90s to the late 2000s, of course that's risen since the late 2000s, but just looking at 91, for example, in 2008, what's interesting is that even though it's the same number of users, the number of those users who have gone to the emergency room related in some way to their marijuana use has gone up about 20 times. And people say, what do you mean emergency room? How is that even possible with marijuana? Well, these are people that, for example, acute psychotic episodes brought on by high THC marijuana from inexperienced users. I mean, not some of the users that have been using for a long time, but I'm talking new users who go and get a marijuana brownie from a medical dispensary and think, well, the brownie, how bad can it be? How high can it make me? When in reality they're ingesting 30% THC in a much more efficient way actually than they would be smoking, and it has that reaction. But about 20 times more people now are going to the ER than they were even 20 years ago. In terms of the parts of the brain that it affects, and we should think about the implications this has on society, we're talking memory, learning, attention, and reaction time, mainly. And again, this doesn't mean that I hear a lot, well, my best friend is, smokes regularly and he's a straight A student. I mean, of course, there are people that do that, and we're not here to say, reefer madness, everyone that ever uses is going to, become homeless tomorrow or use heroin tomorrow. But it's important that we do understand what the risks are, because they have been greatly downplayed by a lot of people who, again, I'm not arguing with, have probably had benign experiences with marijuana, and their experience may be the majority, but it's not what a sizable minority feels in terms of what's happened to them. And it's our duty, I think, to at least alert people of the possibility of these problems. The problem, I think, and I'm going to go off script a little bit, the problem, I think, with doing that, and I talk about this in my book, is that I think Americans have so much baggage when it comes to a drug like marijuana. And what I mean by baggage is that it is true that it was vilified harshly for many, many years, for decades. It is true that some of our early drug laws were racially motivated and are shameful. The fact that they were so racially motivated, that is true. And so those things, and especially sort of an overkill of talking about the dangers, I think has led to a sizable number of Americans to not really believe anything the government says on marijuana. And so, frankly, it's unfortunately we went to one extreme 100 years ago, and now we're on the path to really another extreme as a reaction to that. And that, unfortunately, doesn't allow us to have a proper discussion or debate about the science. It doesn't allow us to have a debate about policy, because people are thinking about, their long-haired college roommate in 1973 who was arrested for, speaking back to a police officer. And they're bringing that baggage into this discussion today. And, while I appreciate there were turbulent times in this country 40 years ago, and marijuana played a central role in many people's identity at that time, we have to talk about the science of today, of 2014, not of 1975 or 1985, let alone 1920. And we have not had that discussion in this country because people are so hung up on their own sort of experiences thinking that marijuana is benign, but we've been unable to talk about this. And frankly, the medical associations, and I'll talk about it in a minute, that are all against it, policies like legalization and call marijuana a public health concern, they are overshadowed by people's own cultural experiences. And I really think that's a shame. One of the reasons we've seen the mental health groups really take hold of this issue and really are beginning now to become very concerned about this, is this link that we're finding time and time again with studies done on mental illness. And the issue is, people say, well, it's a chicken before the egg kind of thing. In other words, what came first? The marijuana use caused, let's say, psychosis or schizophrenia, or was it people predisposed to mental illness for whatever reason, then using marijuana as a way to quote-unquote self-medicate, right? As a way to make them feel better, at least in the short term, even if in the long term it wasn't different. And my answer to that is I really don't care. It actually doesn't matter. Either direction, whether the mental illness came first or the marijuana came first, we are seeing that marijuana makes things worse. Again, whether you're predisposed to mental illness and you're using it as some sort of self-medication, or whether you're not predisposed to mental illness and there is a strong correlation of onset with mental illness from regular marijuana use. It doesn't really matter. What we know is we have now dozens and dozens of well-designed studies showing a very, very tight link to schizophrenia and psychosis, and to some extent, depression and anxiety. We're still learning about those two parts of it. But I think this has been one of the reasons why mental health advocates have become increasingly concerned with high THC marijuana. I don't need to tell you about how marijuana is an irritant to the lungs. What's interesting is that although it contains more carcinogens than tobacco, about 50% more, and we know that there is increased incidence of things like emphysema and COPD among people with, that are heavy users of marijuana, we have not found really, sort of no pun intended, but the smoking gun with lung cancer yet in marijuana. In fact, there might be evidence that there's an enzyme that happens when you smoke marijuana. It doesn't enter your lungs. We're still, scientists are still figuring that out. Again, we don't need to overstate the case on its own. I think marijuana is harmful for the lungs overall. The link to lung cancer is we're just not there yet. We might be where we were 60 years ago with tobacco cigarettes. You all know this week we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Surgeon General's report on smoking, and at that time in 1964, the vast majority of Americans not only thought smoking was harmless, but there was an entire lobby saying that it was not only medicine, but that it was actually it had no link to lung cancer, and the science was bogus. So it's interesting to think about that time and kind of where we are now. But with lung cancer, that evidence really is mixed. If I were to choose one study about marijuana, or really one study about drug abuse, a top three that would stand out over the last 40 years, it would be the one recently done last year, looking at a cohort of over 1,000 people in New Zealand. I'll tell you a little bit about this study. This is what scientists call a longitudinal study. Every single person born in the year 1970 and 1971, every single person born, was enrolled, obviously with their parents' consent at the time, in a longitudinal study in the fourth largest city in New Zealand. What this meant was that every 5 to 10 years, scientists had permission to ask these people hundreds of questions about their life, corroborate it with other people, do very intense examinations of about 1,000 to 1,200 individuals about all sorts of things. I mean, maybe we're looking at, you can just imagine, a million different things. Really, it's a scientist's dream to be able to do a longitudinal study. These people were 38 years old the last time the scientists checked in with them. It's a couple years ago. And at age 38, the scientists wanted to look very closely at marijuana use. And although it wasn't high THC potency marijuana while these kids were growing up, they were still very concerned about whether marijuana changed the trajectory of these people's life at all, as it has been claimed to do. Essentially what they found, and they re-examined their research after being challenged by another researcher. They triple-checked it because it actually looked a little too high even for them. They also checked it with rat and animal studies to make sure they were accounting for socioeconomic factors. And last time I checked, rats don't have a socioeconomic factor, so it's good to check with them as a basis. But essentially what they found was that the people who were heavy marijuana smokers in adolescence, in other words, 3 to 4 times a week, roughly, I believe, for 3 to 4 years. By the time they were age 38, these people who had used heavy in adolescence, and then 15 or so years went by, they exhibited a 6 to 8 point reduction in IQ relative to the group who had not smoked regularly, and they controlled for alcohol use, they controlled for education level, parenting. I mean, they controlled for everything, other drug use. And it's just a very interesting finding, and it sort of is confirming some of the other evidence we have on where exactly in the brain marijuana affects in terms of learning, attention, memory, school performance, etc. And this one I think has a lot of implications, frankly, for teachers, because who is left and blamed when kids don't do well in school, right? It's not the parents usually. It's also not the students. It's usually the teachers for not teaching the kids the exam that the state is mandating. Well, this becomes an issue for education and for teaching, I think. If marijuana use spreads, and we have more people, frankly, with lower IQs. Low productivity and job performance, I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's linked to that. Absences, tardiness, etc. The driving question I get a lot because, and by the way, for those of you that are reporting, it's no big deal. It's fine. They've been told not to, but you can go ahead. Nothing I'm saying isn't already somewhere on the internet, so you go for it. The issue about driving, if it's okay with our hosts, the issue with driving is that essentially all the epidemiologic reviews that have been done looking at the connection between crashes and marijuana use have essentially been boiled down by the Epidemiologic Reviews Journal, which publishes once a year the most robust studies, looking at dozens of other studies that have been done. They published at the end of 2011 finding that essentially marijuana intoxication doubled your risk of a car crash. Now, again, I get a lot of students that come up to me and say, wait a minute, I drive while I'm stoned, and I go, what's wrong with that? I seem to be a slower and actually a more careful driver. Well, I mean, the response to that is it's just as dangerous to drive 35 in a 70 as it is 100 in a 70. And when your depth perception is messed up and you think that the stop sign is there, but it's really here, or the red light is there, but it's really here, that's also a little bit of a problem when you're driving on the road. So marijuana alone is a problem. Combined with alcohol has an exponential problem because we know that alcohol is not 3 or 4 times more harmful than being sober. Put together, the number is very, very high. It's in the double digits. But marijuana alone, even without alcohol, doubles your risk of a car crash. I'm not going to talk about the other myths in great detail, but I just give you a preview of what they are in the book, and you probably can't see them from there anyway. But the second myth I talk about in the book, but I'm not getting into a lot of detail, is the one about medical marijuana. And the bottom line is, and what I tell folks in the elevator speech when they ask you what I do, and then the next question is always, what do you think about medical marijuana? Is essentially, marijuana does contain medical properties. That's true. But we don't need to smoke it to get those properties. That's the bottom line. We do not smoke opium to get the effects of morphine. We do not need to smoke marijuana to get its medical effects. So how do we get its medical effects? Where there are a lot of non-smoked ways to get them. Not only is there a pill of THC, I get that THC isn't the only ingredient we're talking about. There are other ways, whether they're mouth sprays or others, that really I've been arguing need to be fully developed and researched. And we actually haven't done as good of a job as we should in this country on that research. But we do know that the cannabinoids, remember I didn't talk about this, but there are over 500 components or so in marijuana, and when you heat it up, over 2,000. Scientists know about a very low, small number of overall what those cannabinoids even do. We don't really know. But we know some of them can have medicinal properties. I talked about CBD earlier. CBD seems to help people with uncontrollable either seizures or spasticity due to things like multiple sclerosis, which is obviously a horrible disease or condition. And CBD seems to be very helpful for that. And we've seen recently parents and others wanting CBD for their child who doesn't respond to traditional medications, which is a very low percentage of overall kids with epilepsy, but still one that we should pay attention to. And my answer is we really need to allow those parents, frankly, to have that. And so we're actually trying to work with, and I'm trying to work with the federal government to open compassionate research programs for those people who truly have a need. The problem with this, and the reason it hasn't gone as fast as we wanted, is this issue has been politicized. It has been the fact that in California, the recent study found that the average user of medical marijuana was a 32-year-old white man with back pain. Not exactly the cancer patients shown on the television commercials when they passed the initiative. They have found that less than 2% of people in every single state where there's data, less than 2% have cancer, HIV, glaucoma, MS, Crohn's disease, allodynia, any rare condition combined. And so, unfortunately, the 98% sort of ruins it for the 2%. And I think that these issues need to be completely separated, non-politicized. We need to do the research. Yes, the research has sometimes been politicized by the fact that marijuana is illegal. It comes with the territory, but there are ways to overcome that. And we should work with that as opposed to sort of saying it's medicinal for anyone who uses it, and then, when no one's looking, take off the white coat and say this, it's for recreational use. We need to separate those issues. Another myth I talk about in the book at length, I'm not going to talk about here, is this myth that countless people are in prison for pot. Again, we know that that's not true. There's about less than 0.3 to 0.1%. And we looked at this when I was both in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration, in terms, so this was not politicized, in terms of, can we find people in state prison tonight whose only crime was smoking marijuana and they're not on probation or parole? It's difficult to find those people. It doesn't mean that they sometimes don't exist, and when they do, it's usually for higher quantities than what would have been for personal use. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't people in local jails. And I think that there are sometimes, and we need to look at those policies. That is not a justification, though, for a whole-scale change of legalization. And so, whereas we do have people that are arrested for marijuana use, possession, and there are 700,000 of those arrests a year, we need to figure out how to make sure those arrests do not result in something like a criminal record, which is essentially going to hurt people getting jobs and things in the future. I'm in favor of reforming those things. We need to do that. In fact, when NORML started, that was their main objective, was to just remove the criminal penalties. It wasn't so much to get the big corporate interest into legalization, which is unfortunately what it's now become. But in the beginning, it was about removing criminal penalties, and I think there's a lot of common ground with people today on that. That is so different than what we are being presented in Colorado, Washington, and very soon in Missouri, which I'm going to talk to in a minute. And really, that issue of legalization comes to this issue of what are our two legal drugs today. Do alcohol and tobacco, which are our two legal drugs, and you can put in prescription drugs, which are quasi-legal, are those models for where we want to go with marijuana? That's the question we have to ask. That's our track record. And let me tell you, it's not a great track record. 600,000 people dead a year from alcohol and tobacco, $500 billion in lost social costs, which are a tenth of what the tax revenue we bring in every year is, and major corporate conglomerates. And let me tell you something, having worked at the White House, are at front and center of every single representative and senator's door on a daily basis. Are we having fun yet? So that's the issue with marijuana. Do we want to go there? Because that is unfortunately where a lot of not so well-meaning people want to take us. I get that there are a lot of well-meaning people who do this in the privacy of their own home, who would never dream of sharing it with a child, who would never dream of getting involved in other drugs, who don't do other drugs, who would never dream of driving while high. I get that, and there are those people, and that's wonderful. But this movement of where we're going is not centered around those people. It's centered around creating another industry. That's the reality of where we are. And these industries, make no mistake about it, and you can tell I don't get any comfortable with the alcohol or tobacco lobby, is that they promote addiction. And in order to promote addiction, you have to start young, folks, because addiction doesn't start when you're 30. It starts when you're under 18. And by the way, not only do you have to start young, you have to start in neighborhoods that really can't afford the $50,000 check to the Betty Ford Center. And that's why we have 8 times as many liquor stores in poor neighborhoods in this country than in upper-class rich neighborhoods. Am I wrong? So the issue is these industries promote addiction in order for their own livelihood. Remember I talked about the 80-20 rule with alcohol? The 20% of people who consume 80% of the substance of alcohol? That's who is the important customer for the alcohol industry. So all of you that drink a glass of wine every night with your dinner, I hate to break it to you, you are very unimportant to the alcohol industry. Very. You do not contribute to their bottom line at all. They can live with you or not. Who is very important, who are very important, are the 20% of people who should not be drinking under any definition. People committing crime while they're drunk, people destroying their lives, domestic violence, driving and killing people on the roads. Nobody in here would think that they should have the right to drink, yet they do. This is a legal drug. It's ruthlessly promoted and commercialized. And we're sort of stuck with it. We kind of are. Why in the world do we want to be stuck with another intoxicant? Now, we can argue about the harms of marijuana versus alcohol, and there are different harms with different drugs. But as a model for a corporate industry, which is where we're going with marijuana, let's not forget that. That is where we're going. I think we need to at least pause and have a proper national debate on this before we go to that. Because once we do, there really is no turning back. Where's the movement to prohibit cigarettes? Even though I tell you, I don't meet anybody who even defends smoking anymore, including smokers. The smokers that I talk to hate the fact that they're smoking. And by the way, they have nowhere to go to smoke. Their spouse will kick them out of the house. They can't smoke at the mall. They can't smoke in their car because no one will buy that car if they sell it used. Tell me somebody will buy a car, including a smoker that has a smoking smell in it. And we have gotten close to prohibiting cigarettes, yet even still we have a quarter of Americans using, and we still have an industry. And don't make no mistake about it, that industry is still making a lot of money, even though they don't have Joe Camel. They're still advertising in magazines. So the question is, do we want to use that as a model? And you know, I'm looking forward to the Super Bowl, not because it's Seattle versus Denver, and we can call it the Pop Bowl. And there are a lot of jokes about that, but I'm really looking forward to it because I'm looking forward to the beer ads. I'm sure many of you are. The beer ads are the funniest ones. Let's be honest about it. Tell me a better ad, and the beer ads are always the best ones, right? The funniest part to me is not what's in the ad, although it's always funny and very enjoyable. The funniest part to me is the enjoy responsibly moniker that's on the bottom. Why? Because if everybody enjoyed responsibly, we'd have no alcohol industry. We'd have no commercial. That's the amazing part of this whole thing. And when we look at taxes right now for alcohol, because we've always said we're going to raise taxes to pay for schools and things. By the way, how's that working out for you with the lottery here for schools fixed?
Yeah.
That was the promise. Taxes today for alcohol are a fifth of what they were than during the Korean War. There are some people here that have no idea what the Korean War was. So you look like very smart young individuals, so you probably do. But actually, I had to look it up on Wikipedia for the exact years. I certainly wasn't born then. A fifth of what they were when you adjust for inflation. Why? Well, it's called a very powerful lobby on King Street. And if you haven't been to Washington, D.C. before, when you go, you should not only visit our halls of Congress and White House, you should take a stroll down K Street, because that's where most of the power is confined. That's where the money checks are being written. You might remember this, you ran for office. That's the issue here, guys. This is about creating an industry that is going to be very, very difficult. And actually, this looks funny, but there is an industry already starting with marijuana. And as the Wall Street Journal called them, the Yale MBAs are here. Let me tell you something. They got rid of their whatever shirts they wear and cut their hair and got on nice suits and looked really good. Right? Left. People say, look, I take personal offense to that. But no. This is the corporatization of cannabis, as I call it. And it's so ironic to me that the baby boomer generation, the Woodstock generation, that hated corporate entities but loved marijuana, at least for a time, that they are the ones who laid the groundwork for the current legalization movement, which is all about corporate greed and is all about raising money and multi-million-dollar Wall Street investment funds. If you don't believe it, you will be shocked when you go to a website called arcview.com, or probably .com. ArcView is a multi-million-dollar private investing company. In fact, they're having maybe you watch Shark Tank on ABC, where you get to pitch your ideas to business people and you get to get investors to invest in your business idea. Well, they're doing that on January 23rd because they were so excited about that. It was yesterday. Because they were so excited about the president's comments that they decided that they wanted to hold a session to raise money for their industry, and they claim to be now raising millions of dollars from that one sentence that, frankly, has probably been taken out of context. But the amazing thing is that that's what this is about. It is about a corporate industry. It is about marijuana Inc. This is not a theory. This is not a scare tactic to scare you. This is not something that we wish wouldn't happen. It's here. It's already here. And they intend to make millions off of what they call regulated marijuana. In fact, another group called Prohibition Brands, they actually said, we are big marijuana. I mean, I didn't make that up. I wish I did. It's a great one. I wish I did. You can't make this stuff up. Prohibition Brands said they want to create the marijuana version of the Marlboro cigarette. They talked about what you should do as an investor and how it's wonderful, how cigarette companies will want to profit from this from around the world. The Japan Tobacco Company is one example. There's a new population of pot smokers. Then there's the 29-year-old in California who last year, with a wink of an eye, raised $10 million from all sorts of people to create what he calls the Anheuser-Busch of marijuana. Because you can read what his quote was, he wants to be rich. he uses every day. And you know what? He's not just going to be sitting around. He plans to be very rich. As if we need an Anheuser-Busch of marijuana. Already they've spent $1 million on lobbying. And probably in the state they spent that. In fact, when I go to state legislators and I ask who the lobbyists are for marijuana, I've been to at least 2 where the same lobbyist is the lobbyist for the tobacco industry. We shouldn't be surprised. The tobacco industry for 30 years ago said that if marijuana was ever legalized, they would get into it. The consulting report that has now been revealed for the first time in the last couple of years, that was just recently revealed, actually show that in writing. We have the land to grow it, the machines to roll it and package it, and the distribution to market. So if we are so naive to think that legalization is going to be about a couple of our friends getting together and growing a plant in our backyard so we can share it on every Sunday night before we go to bed, we are very naive, because that is not going to happen. I mean, that will happen, but on top of it will be this whole corporate conglomerate. They're having conferences. I mean, in my mind, will marijuana become the new big tobacco is the question. You know, the book I'm working on now looks at the tobacco industry, what they did for 80 years of deceit, looking at their papers. We have now the confidential papers of R.J. Reynolds. We have the confidential papers of Philip Morris. We have the memos that were called youth concepts. And my book is paralleling the tobacco industry with the new marijuana industry because they're following the same playbook. I mean, they showed it's a very profitable playbook. I would too. It's a wonderful playbook if you want to make money and exploit people off of addiction. It's looking at brands that appeal to young people. This was from the 1970s. Apple flavor and sweet flavor were brands of this. Remember, by the way, these are the kinds of memos that literally the day before these execs of these fat cats in the tobacco companies would come and testify in front of Congress and say, no, sir, this is only for the personal use by very responsible adults in the privacy of their own home. We're not talking about kids. Where have we heard that before, by the way? And then literally the next day, writing these memos that they had no compunction. They even titled the memos Youth Cigarette, New Concepts. You know, you've all heard of Winston brand cigarettes, and the model for Winston is very well known now as an anti-smoking advocate because by age 36 he had uncontrollable seizures, lung disease, and emphysema from his many years of smoking because he got free cigarettes while he was the model for Winston. Well, he testified in front of Congress about a very interesting incident that he had after a modeling shoot. There were a lot of cigarettes around his crops, cartons of cigarettes around him. And when the modeling shoot was done, he looked at the executives, R.J. Reynolds at the time. He looked at the executives and said, you know, I'm guessing you're going to want to take these back with you for tonight or whatever, but if you don't mind, you know, he was addicted. If you don't mind, I'd like to take something for free. It's okay. And they looked at him and they said, none of us smoke cigarettes, son. And when he asked why, they said, and this is on congressional record from 1989, they said, we don't smoke the expletive, we just sell it. We reserve that right for the young, the poor, the black, and the student. I mean, this is how outward it was. And again, I just can't imagine that we're not going to go through the same thing if we don't go down this path. You know, prevention people who were here sitting in this room 50 years ago talking about cigarettes, we're all, you know, talking about how to remove tobacco vending machines, which they did a pretty good job of. I don't know if there are any in the state or in your area. More or less, they're gone. I was in Ohio the other day in rural Cleveland, and I saw what looked like a tobacco vending machine in the hallway of a hotel, a nice hotel, but you know, from far away, I thought it was a museum exhibit or something. I was like, oh, it's nice. And I went up to look at it, and it was a real tobacco vending machine. So that was still there. I don't know if we have them here. But what's amazing is that we've gotten rid of most of them, and yet the marijuana vending machines are here. So this is one. There are at least 3 companies. One's called MedBox, that one up. There are a few others reporting millions of dollars of revenue in the last year. And by the way, these are vending machines for medical marijuana. Right, you know, the pot brownie or the grape soda with THC for the dying cancer patient that gets their medicine, I guess, from a vending machine. This is what we're talking about. Yeah, exactly. And again, it's just ironic because it took us 50 years to get rid of vending machines and tobacco. And forget about what are in the products. We're talking about the ring pots, the Pop Tarts, the sodas. All of the things that appeal to kids. The cartoon characters on the front, none of this is, looked at by anybody but these own companies who claim that they're safe. And this is under a so-called regulated market, right? This is under controlled market. We're going to control this, regulate it. This is what it really looks. So I really think that alcohol and tobacco legalization teach us there is no money in this for anyone other than what I would call big marijuana. This corporate industry that's out there to make a lot of money. And let me tell you something. This fifth myth, which is in the book about government problems, as I said earlier, for every dollar gained in alcohol and tobacco tax, it's cost society 10 in social costs. And remember, tobacco is not intoxicating, right? Unlike marijuana. Tobacco doesn't cause car crashes. It does not reduce IQ. It does not produce mental illness. It is not linked to any of those things. It's linked to lung problems and lung cancer, which contributes to 400,000 deaths a year. But you cannot overdose on a tobacco cigarette, just like you can't on a marijuana cigarette. And marijuana happens to not only be harmful for the lungs, we're still figuring out exactly how harmful, but it also has the intoxicating effects of alcohol. Again, these costs are not because 80% of drinkers are bad drinkers and causing costs. These costs are borne by the 20% of users. So, we're going to see what that ratio is for marijuana probably very soon. But this idea that we're going to be able to make money, I don't see how that fits, especially when we've seen things in the past that have been promised, like the lottery that I mentioned before, that hasn't exactly solved our public education system. And if any of you are interested in probably the best book about alcohol prohibition, very evenly balanced, called Last Call, by an academic named Daniel Ockrent. And that was what the Ken Burns documentary was based on his book. He talked about the real reason alcohol prohibition was repealed. Because remember, interestingly, during alcohol prohibition, cirrhosis of the liver was no longer a top 10 killer of white males, like it is now, and like it was then. We also know that drinking went way down, and organized crime went up. And there were different reasons. But he talked about one of the real reasons why did those corporate interests behind prohibition get reversed. Well, it was because the big industrialists at the time who were in favor of prohibition, because they thought that would be good for business to not have families destroyed by alcohol. They were in favor of it. They changed. They changed after 15 years. The main reason was because they were promised no more need for a federal income tax. A federal income tax was relatively new at that point, about 30 years, I think, so old. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but one of the amendments had that. And they thought we would not need a federal income tax. And if you read the document, the CEQA, they got it together, by the way. It was an amazing meeting. I mean, you had all the big industrialists in the 1900s get together about where are we going to put our support. Are we going to keep it with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or are we going to go with something new and really try to repeal this? They went with repeal, and which gave FDR a boost to support repeal, by the way. Mainly because they were promised no more federal. Well, again, how has that turned out? I think April 15th is coming around the corner, unfortunately. We have been promised these things time and time and time again. By the way, if I could just be told when I have 5 minutes, I have 5 minutes. I should have asked. Should never ask. One of the other interesting things that I hear about is this issue of arrests and what would happen if we just treated marijuana like alcohol. So that's what we're doing, right? Treat it like alcohol, and we won't have arrests anymore. Well, this is very surprising for a lot of people to hear, but it's true according to all the statistics that we have in the major statistics on arrests. There are 3 times as many people arrested in this country for non-violent, I emphasize non-violent, alcohol-related arrests than for all marijuana arrests. What do I mean by that? Public drinking, drinking and driving, selling to minors. So there's actually an ironic unintended consequence that could come from legalization, which would increase use, right? I haven't talked about how the price of marijuana would just collapse overnight if we legalized. The prices artificially increase under prohibition. The lower price means more users. More users, a bigger denominator of overall things happening, bigger potential for problems, and that's why with alcohol, again, there are 3 times as many people who are arrested. Those are for regulatory violations, more or less. Which I think is something that we have to think about too. Legalization might have the ironic effect of actually increasing arrests because of the regulatory issues. So I'm going to try and go very quickly past some of this because I only have a few minutes left. I guess I don't really have a lot of time to talk about the recent Department of Justice guidance about legalization, other than to say that the Attorney General did not endorse legalization. He laid out major areas that they would look at in Colorado and Washington. Colorado, Washington legalized. They said, all right, we're not going to go to court. We're going to see how it goes and then decide what we're going to do. And they're going to see how it goes among these things. And the bottom line, and you can have to see all of this on our website, is that we actually don't need to know how it goes because we've known for the last 4 years under Colorado's really, really, really open medical marijuana program, which has gone from 1,000 medical users in 2000s, which might have been legitimate medical users in that time, to over 108,000 a couple years later when the stores opened up, when the mass commercialization started. And we have seen negative effects, drug-related referrals from high school students. 3/4 of Denver area teens in treatment, 74%, reported that they got their marijuana from a medical marijuana dispensary or somebody else's medical marijuana card. So we are seeing the diversion to youth happening already. We don't really need to wait. If Denver were an American state, it would have the highest public high school marijuana use rate in the country. Traffic fatalities have gone up. Kids under 5 years old, I mean, this sounds like, doesn't make sense, sounds like it can't be real, that kids under 5 are going to the ER for marijuana. Well, they are, but they're eating pot cookies. And their 2-year-old brains are being exposed to 30% THC. Yeah, that's a guaranteed night at least in the ER. And it's not funny, it's scary for these parents and these families. But that is happening. I'm going to go over, and Colorado did now officially open up retail sales. And the question is, how has it gone so far? Because the picture you see really is this picture. Everyone's waiting in line. It's wonderful. It's great. They're making millions. But there's an uglier side of this. Like I said, kids and the 2-year-old was already reported last week in Littleton. There are others now going to the ER for getting one of these legal products. A Colorado marijuana store declared that high school seniors were their ideal target audience, even though I thought we were promised this was for 21 and over only. By the way, the city of Denver is now going to reduce it to 18 for possession. These are the same people that during the campaign said they never would want this to get in the hands of kids. That's why we should legalize, to regulate it, right? Because we're doing such a great job with alcohol. Drug dealers don't ID, is what they said. And yet now, it passed, all bets are off. Denver is going to allow for 18. The state was supposed to ID marijuana plants, didn't happen, didn't matter. And already documented on multiple websites, there are new smuggling routes to bring your legal marijuana to neighboring states. Reddit.com documented that. Washington is going to be unveiling this in a couple of weeks. Interestingly, in Washington, also in Colorado, many cities are banning stores altogether. They don't want it to do this, which means that we may have a Netherlands type of situation where you have a few major cities in states that have the concentration of stores. And it may not be actually throughout the state, which is interesting. Washington State is already seeing an increase in impaired driving. So I just want to finish with, I reject this notion that we only have 2 choices. Really, in drug policy generally, I mean, the marijuana is what we're talking about tonight, but this applies to both. I reject the notion that our choices are between legalization on one hand, or regulation, as it's called, or prohibition or incarceration on the other. I think we have been sold a false dichotomy. I think that they're both travesties. I think the for-profit prison industry is an abomination and an embarrassment. I also don't get money, as you can tell, from the prison industry. We're quickly learning that I'm very poor. But anyway, but I don't think we need to replace one problem in the inner city of mass incarceration with another problem of mass commercialization. Because, by the way, those communities, like I said, will be targeted just like they are now for alcohol. We can be smarter than that. I don't know why those have to be our 2 choices. Why can't we have a policy where low-level users aren't given criminal records, they're not criminalized for low-level amounts if they're not using, while they're driving or giving it to minors, that's kind of cute. I think we can do better than either of those. So we started a group called Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which I'm going to end on. And we actually have a bipartisan group with us, Patrick Kennedy on the left and David Frum, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush on the right. They don't agree on anything, by the way. You can imagine what the conversations or like board meetings, they don't agree with anything except for this issue, which is that we can do better than either of those two extremes. And our chief worry in this whole thing, where we're going in this country, is that we are creating a third profitable corporate industry that will exploit people that are the most vulnerable among us, that will deny the science, just like the tobacco industry has denied science for 80 years. That's their whole business model. And that will ruthlessly promote this. And that's really what we worry about with regards to legalization. We think there's a better way. So thank you very much for listening to me tonight, and I look forward to your questions.
So right now is the time to gather up the question cards. If you wouldn't mind passing them to the center aisle. Robin, Kelly, and some of our volunteers will be helping. And Kelly, thank you very much for helping us go through this. Appreciate it. Well, I'm fiddling with it. I'm going to introduce Erica Manahan. She is here with us from Springfield, Missouri. She is the director of the Regional Support Center at the Community Partnership of the Ozarks. She is going to come and unveil a statewide initiative that is getting ready to be unfolded. And Erica, if you would mind coming up here.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. While she's trying to, my name on the screen, not that you really need to see it, but I can see it. That was good. My name's Erica Manahan. You can read that for later. You can write it down. But like she said, I'm with Community Partnership of the Ozarks. We are one of 11 regional support centers in the state of Missouri that work on prevention. And we cover a 21-county area. And all of our prevention specialists work with community coalitions in those areas to basically work on community level change and bringing education and all sorts of different prevention activities. And so it's been my honor and privilege to work with the 3 coalitions that really put this event together, and that's the Newton County Coalition, the Joplin Area Coalition, and Carthage Caring Communities. So it's been my honor and pleasure to do that, and I'm especially excited to unveil this Think Again campaign to you guys. This is really the product of the hard work of coalitions from across the state of Missouri. We really felt like it was important to put forth an effort to create a unified message that really calls individuals to think again about marijuana. There's currently a lot of myths and a lot of misinformation out there about that specific drug, and so we aim to bring facts, really, that are based on science, so that we can bring those things to the discussion and be able to provide that opposite viewpoint. So these coalitions are really working on taking a stand against marijuana legalization, and the Think Again campaign is really a platform for that stand. So without further ado, so this is the logo that we have developed. I'm not sure if everyone can see that. That's the logo that the coalitions across the state have really developed as that messaging campaign is going to be our logo and our slogan there, so that we are identified as we are the people who are trying to provide that education with that evidence and that scientific facts. And some of the information that we now possess, thanks to Kevin and his crew, you know, are available to you through these coalitions. So one of the things, of course, is the logo. A second thing that we will have, we're currently working on constructing a website. That website will be thinkagainmo.org. Again, thinkagainmo.org. So you can visit that. Be patient with us. We are still constructing it, but we've got some information up there for you currently so that you can go to that if you so desire. We're going to have a YouTube channel. We mentioned that this is live streaming on a Google Hangout, but there's also going to be a recorded version available on YouTube. So that's under the same title, Think Again MO. If you go to YouTube, you can access that there. Another thing that our group has been working on, if you're interested, is a proclamation, which really just kind of is something that we want individuals and agencies to sign to say that we do not support marijuana legalization. We've got a lot of information and facts on there along with the sources. So that will be shared with area coalitions, and if you're interested, you can talk to any one of the people you've seen on stage here tonight, and we can give you more information about that. And last but not least, that group, that statewide kind of group that's come together under the Think Again name, is really working on putting together some strategic plans to sort of spread this statewide and really make sure that we get our message heard as well, and just take that stand and present the information that we have as well. So if you are ever interested in becoming part of that, like I said, talk to any one of us. We would be happy to get you plugged in and connected. And the other thing that I am to announce to you tonight is that on your way in, you should have received a yellow slip that looks like this. If you didn't, we can get you one. But basically, this is a QR code that takes you to a SurveyMonkey. So you can do this on your phone. And if you wouldn't mind just evaluating the forum tonight, the things that you heard, you can wait until the very end after you've heard the panel and everything like that. But we would love to get your feedback so that we can kind of hear from everyone. So we would enjoy that. Okay, I'm going to hand this back over to Chelsea.
Okay, I am going to do my best. Your handwriting. All right, we'll start with a question to anyone. Anyone want to speak on this? With information we have been given tonight, how can we effectively stop the railroading of marijuana's legalization in Missouri? Okay.
I think it's to get involved. To get involved in your local community coalition, but also in efforts across the country that are going on. Because I think that a lot of people think this is inevitable, right? They think that this has happened in 2 states, this is going to happen everywhere, and there's really no way to stop it. I have to tell you that over the last 2 months since we've had legal sales in Colorado, I feel like that has woken up a lot of people. There is actually, it's sort of, laws of physics. An effect produces a counter effect. There have been more people now talking about what the reality of legalization is and how they don't like it than there really ever have before. And just an evidence of that is, you saw David Brooks in the New York Times, who never talked about this issue, come out against it the same day that you saw a center, really left Democrat, Ruth Marcus in the Washington Post, and a far left Democrat, Tina Brown. So you had the left, the center, and the right in a matter of a week basically questioning, is this the road that we want to go on in our country? So with smart approaches to marijuana, and Sam and Patrick and other people, those of us involved want to do is try and stop this freight train. And we think that in a strange sense, it has taken the legalization in a few states for people to say, wait a minute, I thought I was voting just for adults to be able to grow a plant or smoke a joint in the privacy of their own home. I didn't realize that I was actually voting for a pot shop in my backyard, or on the way to my kid's school when he's walking to school, or brownies and edibles that are marketed to junior high kids. I didn't realize that there was a movement, by the way, not normal as some of those movements, but where the big money is in this country, in terms of a couple of the big think tanks that are giving money to this movement. This is not about marijuana. This is about going to all drugs, and they've said that very openly. So I think a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, we thought we voted for one thing, it's really another. And they're actually wanting to get involved. So go to our website, learnaboutsam.org, go to the websites of the organizations here tonight, and there's plenty for people to do.
Kevin, go ahead and keep the mic. I have another question for you. Many proponents of legalization cite problems with incarceration and harsh sentencing as reasons to legalize. Is there a good way to provide treatment and counseling to users to address these issues without resorting to full legalization?
I mean, of course there is, and we talked about drug court tonight. It doesn't mean that every user of marijuana needs a drug court, or every user even needs treatment. So a lot of people actually stop using for a variety of reasons. What it does mean is that we have much better ways to deal with this than in the criminal justice system for those people who have low levels. I would be surprised, and I thank the men and women of uniform for being here tonight, who are here serving our community. I would be surprised to even hear from them that they would like and they promote a policy of locking up people for small amounts. That's just not where law enforcement resources currently are. That doesn't mean that there aren't arrests. That doesn't mean that there aren't other circumstances that come into play and that this can sometimes be used for other motives. We need to reform and change those things. But we don't need to legalize in order to fix a problem of arrest or incarceration. We have many better ways. Drug court is one. Hope probation is one. 24/7 South Dakota, what they're doing with drunk driving and how they're revolutionizing it in South Dakota is incredible. You should all look into that. You should look into Hope Hawaii, what they're doing with other drug users there by not locking them up for long amounts of time, yet they are stopped. They're not using for various reasons. So there are a lot of innovative ways to deal with this, I think, short of incarceration, but also short of just saying, all right, we're going to let this go and open this up.
Okay, Nick, this is for you. So after sharing your story, this question comes out. You can get over an addiction, but how do you get over the conviction? Yeah.
Well, I was detained. I wasn't actually arrested. I was charged with possession, but that came off when I turned 17. That was I was in the juvenile system, I think, and once I turned 17, that went away. As long as I didn't have any other violations or anything like that. So I mean, I kind of got off scot-free, and I got really lucky. The officers who arrested me were, for the most part, pretty nice, and I don't think that they thought that I, really knew what I was doing. Because when I was arrested, I really didn't know what I was doing. I was smoking pot in my car with my buddy at about 1 o'clock in the morning in a Panda Express parking lot. And the ironic part is I was literally right across the street from the police station. That's the funniest part of it is, no, not at all. I had been smoking pot for about 6 months at that point. No, I was also drinking, so that didn't help, but it wasn't at all the smartest decision. And I mean, it didn't take me long. I mean, I think we were there for all about maybe 2 to 3 minutes before a police officer rolled through and asked us what we were doing. The smoke poured out into her face, and she asked me to get out of the car and everything else. So.
Okay. Thank you. Kevin, with all the negative statistics shared tonight, obviously about marijuana, why on earth would Colorado legalize the drug?
Let's be very clear. There's a big gap, first of all, between the public's understanding of marijuana and the scientific understanding. So I don't think that the public knows that, for example, last month, the American Medical Association came out with an official position against legalizing marijuana sales and calling it a public health concern. I don't think they know that the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the National Cancer Institute, the American Cancer Society, the Multiple Sclerosis, every single major medical association has come out. So there's this huge gap, and a lot of it, again, has to do with the fact that most people have benign experiences with marijuana. And so they feel like, well, society can probably handle it. Not fully understanding that this is about a corporate movement, this is about a movement to increase addiction. You only profit when there's higher rates of addiction, right? You're not making money from people who are casual, responsible, occasional users. And I think a lot of people just felt like, what's the big deal? The pot I smoked 30 years ago in the north, my friend, didn't hurt me, and maybe this is a way to increase revenue. We've been chasing revenue in this country since its founding, and whether it's with the lottery, with gambling, with whatever else. And so I think a lot of people bought those ideas, and I also think, that and a couple of $1 million usually helps in the political system. And these campaigns each had upwards of $3 million, whereas there was really very little money in the opposition, very little. In Colorado, they scraped together a few $100,000 and could not afford one advertisement. In Washington State, it was zero. Why zero? Well, prevention organizations are not political hacks. They're saving lives. Treatment centers are saving lives every day. They're not Karl Rove or James Carville. They don't have the money for the political ties, and you can't spend public money on that. So it was really, really hard in these states to see these own prevention and treatment centers who are going to be feeling the brunt of it. And by the way, the need for treatment in Colorado, in one area that I know, has tripled. What's ironic is that it's in the treatment center's interest actually to legalize, right? Because there's going to be more users and more addicts. But these centers they're all against it. They've seen the toll. They don't want it, even though it's in their financial interest to want it. The private ones at least. And so I just think a lot of people really believe the very, very smart rhetoric that this would help schools and solve a whole lot of problems, and they were never exposed to the potential negative.
Okay, this question deals a little bit with the medical properties and vaporization. So, in the name of risk reduction, what's your beef against vaporization for patients? It has lower carcinogens and no products of combustion.
Well, I think for vaporization, we're talking about medical, in this case, it's patients, I guess. First of all, I would not begrudge anybody, let's be very clear, with a truly debilitating chronic illness to use anything that made them feel better. Okay, let's just be I don't think any of us would, whatever substance it is. That is very different than saying all marijuana use is medical, that we're going to have these dispensaries with candies and lollipops and all these things that we're selling, and we're going to cover it under the guise of people with cancer, which is the way this has been sold. So let's just make that very clear. I don't think anybody would begrudge somebody in fourth stage cancer or with chronic debilitating pain, which is a horrible thing also, to take anything that might help them. The point is, how do we translate that into policy? It makes more sense to me, and it's a lot more compassionate to me, to tell that person who's debilitating, you know what, we have a product that's actually been tested in some ways at least, or you'll be enrolled in a research program where we can at least monitor how you're doing, even if it hasn't been approved yet. And you know what, you can go to your pharmacy and talk to your doctor about it. And they can tell you what your dosage is. They can tell you how it interacts with other medications you might be taking. They can tell you, based on your age and weight, how you should take it. As opposed to the status quo in a place like California, which is basically saying, oh, you want medical marijuana? Okay, you can't talk to your pharmacist because they don't dispense it. You can't talk to your doctor because they know no idea about it. What you do need to do is go, on the sort of wrong side of town, to the strip mall next to the old pizza shop. There's a little store with a green cross and a neon sign in front. Once you get past the 300-pound bouncer, you're going to see another guy who's a doctor. You're going to give him $100 cash, where he's going to look at you and write something on a piece of paper saying you should get your marijuana. Then you're going to walk to the other side of the store and buy something called Super Silver Haze from a 23-year-old. That's our version of compassion. I don't think that's compassionate, personally. So I think we should do medical marijuana right. There are medicinal properties in marijuana. It's not hard, folks. We've done it for opium. We would not ask you to inject or smoke opium to get those medical effects. So let's put it in a safe way. Vaporization was a specific question. Vaporization, there's been one FDA product for vaporization, I believe it was to handle diabetes. It was taken off the market because you actually cannot control the heat despite the claims. And it is not a safe way to ingest a substance. So I would say for the mass population, vaporization would not be the way to go. Probably a mouth spray, probably something much better than a pill, because a pill isn't always the best thing either. So thankfully, we're living in 2014 where we've developed these medications. So we don't have to go back to the 1700s where we have no idea how these medications work. We do. We need to do more research. And today, if I had the pen, I would enroll every single debilitating cancer or pain patient or MS patient who said they benefited from medical marijuana in a special federal research program where they would get a mouth spray or a non-smoke way to ingest marijuana, and they would get a standardized product, and we wouldn't have these crooks making millions of dollars off of compassion.
Okay, this question goes back to the newest Gallup poll. It shows 58% of Americans are for legalization of marijuana. So how can prohibition be in line with our ideals?
Talk about disproportionate here. So anybody want to chime in? I mean, I'll say one thing about the Gallup poll. Let's talk about it. But essentially, yes, the Gallup poll showed 58%. The CNN poll showed 55%. The Rasmussen poll from a month ago showed 42%. With 50% opposition. The ABC Washington Post poll showed 49% in favor, I think 48 against, it was an even split. The CBS poll today showed 51 in favor, 49 against. Yes, it looks like, and there's no doubt that the support for legalization has risen dramatically in the last 10 years. Whether it's 58%, I think we'll have to see what the future polls say, but when you take all the polls together, it looks a lot closer to more like a 52, 49, or even a split. We don't know exactly. The different polls have said different things. Again, no doubt there's been more acceptance. And I think there's been more acceptance because there's been a huge surge of, frankly, a lot of propaganda that's not in line with the science, that essentially is saying this is relatively harmless and we can make a lot of money off of it if only we control and regulate. And a lot of people are looking at it that way and they're saying it's better than alcohol for you, so alcohol's legal. Why wouldn't we just legalize marijuana? It's worse for you. That to me is like saying, your headlight is busted, and so to be consistent, you should bust your tail up. Or it's to be a lot more morbid, much more. I'm sorry for my being so candid. It is like saying, well, I'd rather my wife get breast cancer instead of cervical cancer because breast cancer has a 10% mortality rate, whereas cervical cancer is more than 7%. So if I had to choose, why do we have to choose? Question. I mean, alcohol legalization is here to stay. No one's seriously calling for its prohibition. But on every single scale of public health, it will certainly expand. Now, we've just turned in that right. We think our right to drink is more important. I think that too. I personally don't drink, but I think for society, it probably makes sense right now that it's legal. But we're living with it to our peril. It doesn't provide any example for any other drug other than a warning that we don't want corporate interests like we do for this drug.
All right. Next question is talking about side effects. So when you look at medications such as Xanax, Prozac, Oxycontin, and several others, and their side effects, and when you look at marijuana side effects, they're nowhere near the same. So why is it that marijuana is considered a poison, but these drugs are so widely defended as medicine, and when there is 0 death toll for marijuana and multiple deaths for other medications?
I guess the questions are corresponding to the time of the spoke. I didn't know that. I would have shut up.
The rest of them
I mean, the issue, of course, prescription drugs can be deadly and have been deadly and have decimated populations and are, in my opinion, it's the #1 drug issue in America. And we have more overdoses every day than car crashes. We didn't have that 20 years ago. That's a huge issue. What does that tell me? That tells me that another corporate interest that we haven't talked about a lot tonight, and I'm also not paid by that, so called Big Pharma, was out there 10 years ago giving incentives to their salesmen to make sure that these drugs were prescribed at a level that is 20 times any acceptable level. We consume over 90% of the opioid medications in the world. Is it just because Americans are living more painful lives than our European or South American or Asian or African brothers and sisters? No. It's because we have this industry also. And by the way, that's a class of legal drugs. Oxycontin is a perfect example. Exactly. It's an epidemic. I agree. Okay, so not an example, by the way. We want to avoid that example. And to say, well, the marijuana is so much safer, so why don't maybe that could be safer? You know what? Let's produce marijuana in a non-smoked way for those people that need it, where traditional medications or other medications don't work as well, or produce these nasty side effects. And nobody in this room, I don't think, is going to have a problem with that. But to say that marijuana has never killed anybody, honestly, is about as laughable as to say that cigarettes has not killed anybody. This is what I mean. Cigarettes do not produce overdose. You cannot smoke yourself to death in the city, just like you can with marijuana. So what? I wouldn't say that cigarettes don't cause death. They're linked to lung cancer, but the lung cancer causes death. The lung disease causes death. The emphysema causes death. Well, guess what? With marijuana, which leads to impaired driving, the impaired driving causes death. Suicide, by definition, is causing death. And we know about the link between suicide, depression, and marijuana, heavy marijuana use. So this thing about killing, it doesn't kill anybody, is ridiculous. When we look at the levels of harm, on the individual level, a drug like OxyContin can produce horrible harm, and it can produce a death at that point in terms of an overdose. Yes, it does. And it's harmful. There are also medicinal uses of OxyContin. There are. And there are medicinal uses of opioids, just like there are medicinal uses of cannabinoids. We just need to be able to deliver it in the framework.
Okay, so in sake of time, and unless you guys all want to stay here this evening, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we will be dismissed for a reception and book signing. But Kevin, one last question here. How do you justify denying responsible adults the freedom to make their own choices in order to keep this marijuana away from young people when young people currently have much greater access to marijuana than adults?
The premise of the question about young people having greater access to marijuana than adults have access to marijuana, I had not seen that data. I'd be interested to see it, but let's just take it for what it is in terms of how do you justify that. You know what? If you're a responsible adult in the privacy of your own home, you're not taking care of my kid, I'm not a kid yet, but when I do, you're not driving on the roads, you're not employed by me or going to the healthcare system uninsured, and so that taxpayers have to foot the bill. Have a blast. I really don't care what you do in the privacy of your own home. And guess what? A lot of people are smoking marijuana in the privacy of their own home under current policy. Some of you in this room tonight will go home and smoke marijuana even though it's illegal. Have fun with that. That's not what legalization is about. It's not about the right of you to go smoke a joint like you did for the last 40 years with your friends. It is about an industry that was going to start with young kids and hook them, just like we had tobacco. It is about unleashing corporate capitalist markets for marijuana that will therefore increase addiction and line the pockets of a couple of billionaires that are the ones that are funding legalization in this country. So I don't think it's healthy for you to do that if you're an adult. It's probably on balance unhealthy. It could lead to a lot of negative outcomes. We've heard about those outcomes tonight by people much more knowledgeable and close to this than I am. It's not something I would encourage. But the fight against legalization, I hate to tell you, especially the baby boomer generation, is not about you. It's not. It is about the next generation and the kind of country that we want to build. Do we want a country where a lot more people smoke marijuana, which is the inevitable result of legalization because the price drops and people use? That's what this is about. It's about creating the next Marlboro, the next Camel, the next Anheuser-Busch, in their own words. It's not about reliving your glory days of Kent State. And we should realize that. We should be in congruence with the science and what the AMA says on this, and realize that although we don't want to saddle your life with a criminal record that's going to ruin your chance to get a job or change your life, in order to reform that wrong, we don't need to replace it with another wrong, which would be mass increased use of marijuana.
All right, thank you. And you guys are dismissed if you'd like to go to birth.